My name is Brad Law and currently a Principal Research Scientist at DPIRD in a Forest Science Unit. It's a huge part of my life. I love what I do. I love the forest wildlife. I love being out in the forest. We spend a lot of time in lots of different forests, up north, down south, also out west. Been working on wildlife ecology in forests for about 25 years and we do research to try and understand how the animals are faring in the forests. So we do a lot of work on threatened species, and we try and understand how different species respond to forest harvesting, what impacts does it have, how do their populations change over time, you know, how we can make small changes to forest practices to improve conservation for different species. That's the sort of thing that we do. And you know, not just timber harvesting, but fire is a big part of forests, so we also look at effects of fire. We've done a lot of habitat mapping for koalas. There's a lot of habitat that's mapped out in those forests. There's about 1.6 million hectares in northeast New South Wales. And I think when we started, it's probably fair to say most people thought koalas didn't occur in a lot of those forests. So we've then gone out, we've surveyed over 220 sites, and we've found koalas in you know, a high percentage of those sites, say 60 to 70%, and that's a lot more than what people would have previously thought. So that really does change the picture for the status of koalas in those, particularly those public forests. Very surprised, yeah, because that was not the, you know, the standard view of the time. We used a different method, yeah, the results blew us away. And now other methods are being applied, like drones with thermal cameras, and they're finding the same things, that koalas are much more common in these forests than we previously thought, because they're so cryptic, they're really hard to see. Koalas are a bit of a complicated story, like it's very different from place to place. So you've got the coastal strip where there's a lot of urban development, and cars and dogs, they're under a lot of pressure in those areas. Further west, out in some of the cypress country, where it's hot and there's been severe droughts, the populations have really suffered there. But the northeast is a bit of a different kettle of fish. You know, they're productive forests, they get good rainfall, and the koalas have really persisted pretty well in that area. They're not really under threat from cars and dogs in those public forests. So it's a different situation, but fire is probably the big threat for them in those forests. Repeated fires. We've been GPS tracking koalas, so we catch them and put a collar on, and we can follow where they go, and we can track them down and see what trees they like to feed on. They definitely feed on those young regenerating trees, but just as much they use the areas that are left aside for environmental protection. So it seems to us they really need both, or they use both. They use those young trees growing up, and they use the other areas as refuge areas or whatever, but they use that whole of their local landscape. Look, we've specifically tried to look at how timber harvesting affects koala populations, and we've done that in a number of different ways. So we've done this big broad survey across all these 220 odd sites in the northeast, and we found no relationship between whether a site was harvested and whether you would detect koalas. So at that broad scale, it didn't look as though timber harvesting was having an effect on where koalas were occurring. And then we did a more detailed study at a local scale where we actually set up an experiment. We went to sites before they were harvested, tried to estimate how many koalas were there. We came back after it was harvested and looked at the change. And we also had control sites in nearby national parks for a comparison. We actually found no effect of timber harvesting on the koala numbers. So it was quite a detailed study which no one has done before. Look, I mean, I think our results, those results as well as the GPS tracking we've done to see how they use the forest after it's been harvested, I think it does tell us that we can balance protecting koalas at the same time as you know, undertaking forestry under the rule set that's in place. So there are regulations set by the EPA. I think that, you know, so there are protections in place for the koalas, and they seem to be doing a good job. That's what our results are telling us. We surveyed after those big black summer fires, and we did find a big effect of when you have really bad bushfires in a local area. We saw big drops in koala numbers, which we don't see after timber harvesting. So we really think that it's those big fires that are going to get more common with climate change that's going to be the big threat to koalas. And that's going to occur right across all tenures. I think we need to do something about how forests are managed to minimise the effects of those really out of control bushfires. It's going to be more and more important in the future. I think we still have a lot to learn on how best to do that, but that's definitely part of what we need to be doing. Yeah, look, there's different ways, I suppose, you can assess the health of the forest. It could be just like the growth rates of trees or how common different tree species are, or it could be the suite of wildlife species that occur in a forest. So for me, yeah, it's documenting the diversity of species and how well their populations are doing, how they're changing over time. And that's really one of the most important things I think that we can be doing as wildlife ecologists, looking at how things are changing over time. And we're now starting to get that picture. So for our koala data, we've been looking at their population since 2015, and we're finding that fairly stable trend over time. So they're actually quite difficult animals to understand because they're very hard to see. You can go out into the forest and you just don't see them, you don't know that they're there. So we've been developing new methods to try and find out what they're doing. One of those methods is using acoustic recorders that can pick up on male koalas when they're bellowing during the mating season. So we've been able to use that to survey different areas. We record everything in the forest. Anything that vocalises, we record. And up until recently, we just haven't been able to analyse that kind of data. But now we have AI algorithms, a bit like Shazam for music. You can Shazam a koala bellow or you can Shazam a glider call. And we're now analysing all that data. We're still in the middle of that process, but we will have a fantastic data set to look at changes of these different species over time. That's one of the big advantages in the approach we're taking. So we have done some analyses for, say, the yellow-bellied glider as an example. It's another threatened species, requires hollows in trees. The same data set where we've been recording this since 2015, before and after those black summer fires, and what we saw was that the gliders took a hit of about their population dropped by about 34% with those fires, but then we've had good rainfall since and they're now on a trajectory upwards, so their populations are recovering, close to being back to what they were pre-fire. The regulations that are put in place, like, they're really quite complex and there's a lot of different regulations for different species and they've all got to come together as part of the planning process. They're based on our best available knowledge, but a lot of that does require testing and monitoring, and that's part of our job to do that, and that's why we're looking at how these different species track over time. That's a really important part of the process, and a lot of what we're seeing is that many of those, or most of those protections are working. They are providing important habitat and helping many species, most species, to maintain themselves. So a big part of our job is to work out ways that you can balance production with conservation. So production can be on-farm production, it can be timber production, or it can be production of fisheries. And you don't necessarily have to have one without the other, and I think it's really important for the world going forward that we learn how to do this. We have to have sustainable industries, and that's what our role is, to work out how we can do this. So our job is to produce the science to underpin governments making decisions on these sorts of things.